I have a question. You mentioned that where you work, you have the Torah in, I don't know if you call it an ark or a place, and you mentioned, though, it's not the only book. I was curious, what are the other books that have, that are in that spot?
Well, they actually rotate. They can be books of poetry, they can be books of history. I've even put my Kindle in there when I was reading for my Kindle one year. You see, we use the Torah primarily either for bar bat mitzvahs or for our high holiday services, but we only use it for some of the high holiday services. So our Rosh Hashanah evening or Yom Kippur evening service will have a Torah reading, though not always the traditional Torah reading. It might be another piece that I want to talk about. And then in the morning, I'll read from another piece of Jewish literature that's in dialogue with the earlier story. It's again demonstrating that intertextual approach. So the volume that'll be in there will be the other books I'm going to be reading from over the course of the high holidays for that particular year. Now, if I were to choose sort of permanent books that were there, and we're in a rental space, and so we have temporary use of the space. So we have a portable ark actually, and a dolly that we roll it out and put it away on. So if we had a permanent ark built in, I would actually put bookshelves on it. I would put some important books. I would put, first of all, the whole Hebrew Bible, not just the Torah. I would put a volume of academic archaeological history. I might put one of our movement's anthologies called Judaism in a Secular Age, which collects 50 different thinkers and people who help to articulate what a secular Jewish identity could be, including many of the framers of our movement that some of you may have heard speak before. I might include some examples of non-Jewish philosophy and poetry that are truly inspirational and really articulate our understanding of the human condition. And I think I would still circulate books in and out, because part of the point is that we shouldn't be static. We shouldn't assume that knowledge is always one version and is fixed forever. It should include new books from time to time. So that would be my approach in a more permanent setting of a library in the Ark as opposed to the Ark in the library.
Thank you.
Someone else asked, have you come to the Humanistic Judaism from a secular and affiliated background or a more traditional background? The answer is neither, because I'm, I guess, young enough. I grew up in Humanistic Judaism at the Birmingham Temple outside of Detroit. My parents were the ones who joined. In fact, I have a picture of myself with Rabbi Sherwin Wine when I'm this big at my baby naming event. So my mom actually had him as her confirmation rabbi when he was still a Reform rabbi at Temple Bethel in Detroit. So we were, I was always a humanistic Jew, actually. My undergraduate studies at Yale, I majored in Jewish studies. But I was coming from a different perspective. Instead of being traditional, secularizing by university study, I became more exposed to traditional Judaism through my university programs. But I've always been a humanistic Jew, so actually I'm kind of boring. I'm celebrating my family tradition. I'm doing it the same way I've always done it. But I still find it relevant and meaningful, and I've passed it on to my kids as well. My son just had his bar mitzvah this year. He spoke about the story of Noah and read from the Torah scroll as well, but also used it as a springboard to talk about the wildfires in Australia, and in particular his love of animals and his concern for what happened to the animals in the aftermath of that wildfire. His Tzedakah project was raising money to adopt a koala through a charitable fund there that does that. This is my family tradition, and I find it meaningful to carry it forward. But that doesn't mean I do it exactly the same way my rabbi did. As I mentioned, Sherwin Wine didn't really use the Torah very much by the time I became part of a humanistic Jewish congregation. It had become something he had left behind, and I felt the need to bring it back in some ways, but in a way that felt authentic to our values. So we don't parade it, we don't kiss it, but it does have an arc. I invite people to stand, but I don't require them to stand, because some of them decide they don't want to stand for this book. They have read too much of it and decide they don't like enough of it. That's fine too. I don't require them to stand for a tikvah or a national anthem either. That is their choice always. So part of the value system for us is that people make up their own minds and have their own choice of connection. And so we celebrate that diversity, not just the uniformity.
There's a question from Brenda in the chat for you.
Would you comment on Harold Bloom's argument that there was a woman writer of part of the Torah? So this is based on a book called The Book of J, which the literary critic Harold Bloom wrote in 1988, something like that, in the late 80s. Part of the challenge is that, unfortunately, sometimes people write outside of their area of expertise. The same is true, by the way, for Sigmund Freud, who was a brilliant descriptor of the human psyche and of family dynamics and things like that. But he dabbled in archaeology at the end of his life with a book called Moses and Monotheism. And unfortunately, it's not particularly believable. if you know anything about the archaeology or critical study of the Bible. And unfortunately, I think the same may be true for Harold Bloom's study. He's a literary critic, but he's not a scholar of ancient languages. He's not a scholar of ancient texts that he could compare it with other sources. There were women authors in this period, by the way. One of the first written texts we have, one of the oldest written texts we have, is a prayer to a goddess that was written by a priestess, as best we can tell. So it is not inconceivable that women were literate. But to try to deduce whether an author was a woman or not based on the interpreted characteristics of a book he's trying to abstract from its mixed in status in the current Torah to its original status as a separate document outside of the Torah, that's, I think, too far of a leap to really be credible. And the other thing I would keep in mind is, he's writing this in the late 1980s. This is a very gender essentialist era where people assume men think this way and women think this way. I have a feeling if you reread that book now, it would feel very passé in that kind of men think this way, women think this way, therefore this must have been a woman writer kind of thinking. So I don't give it a lot of credibility. It's an interesting interpretation and theory. Congratulations, Harold Bloom, you wrote something interesting. I don't know that it's the truth. It's more of an intertextual response, which as a literary critic, he's certainly welcome to do. Well, if not, I have one final piece to share with you. It's a short passage from the liturgist Marcia Falk, who has a wonderful book called The Book of Blessings, which explores a Shabbat cycle, and also recently came out with one for the High Holidays, which is a fantastic collection of poetry. I had to stop myself from taking more and more of the selections in it for our services because many of them were really wonderful. But in her Book of Blessings, which is designed around Shabbat, she has a passage where she talks about what she means by Torah. And I think it really resonates with us, so much so that I did use it in one of our high holiday services, our Yom Kippur morning service, where we're reading something that's not from the 5 books of Moses, but is still in that ark along with the Torah scroll. In a tradition that views Torah as sacred and values the study of Torah beyond all else, we consider with utmost care what is Torah and what it means to honor it. The rabbis said, turn it, for all is contained in it. We turn and we turn, but not all is in it. We find we have more to add. We cannot read all our truths into a place where they have never been. And so we invent and inscribe, and we ask, can new texts too become sacred? Can our own voices become Torah? And throughout the process, we ask what it means to us to keep on wrestling with tradition. How do we know when we have wrestled enough? How do we know when it is time to let go, time to free ourselves for something new? We ask these questions here today in the context of our service because questioning in pursuit of our deepest truths is itself a form of Torah, of teaching, of learning. We ask our questions fully realizing that well-meaning people among us may differ, perhaps vehemently in their answers. It is not our purpose to be divisive, but we are already of many minds. Silencing the concerns will not diminish them. It will not make them go away. Dare we ask these questions? Dare we not ask them? If not now, when? Someone suggested doing like a commentary of the Torah. That's a lot. That's a lot of work. I even have a title for that one too. So that Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya, who was the heretic rabbi who questioned divine justice, is sometimes known as Acher, the other person. And so I was joking that if I wrote a Torah commentary, it would be Davar Acher, which means like a word of the heretic, but also in rabbinic literature, Davar Acher means another interpretation, an alternate meaning. So that might be my approach to a commentary. But you don't only need me to do examples of these kind of creative commentaries. Richard Elliott Friedman, the biblical archaeologist, has a commentary to the Torah where he brings in his approach as an archaeologist. There is a book called Torah Queries, which is bringing an LGBTQ perspective into each of the Torah portions and offering commentaries on those. There's a volume called A Women's Torah Commentary that's bringing in feminist and women's perspectives to these stories in many cases where they have not been offered before. And so there are all kinds of options out there. Unfortunately, the shelf gets bigger and bigger with all the commentaries one needs. And we'd have to decide if there's enough of an audience for a secular or a heretical or a whatever commentary on the Torah that might be of interest. Now, the latest Pew study of Jewish Americans that came out for 2020, just this past week, suggests there's a growing population of what Pew calls Jews of no religion. And so maybe they'd be interested in a Torah commentary, but my guess is they'd want to read it on TikTok and not on a full volume commentary. That's my guess. Someone asked, do we use Sefaria? Of course, Sefaria is a wonderful resource, particularly if you're literate in Hebrew. It's an online resource for not only the original text and translation, that's a relatively good translation, but they also include a lot of commentaries from Rashi, from Maimonides, from all kinds of commentators. And you can create source sheets. It's really a wonderful resource for people to be able to access the sources. What do you make of marginal voices attempting to reclaim elements, sometimes forcing progressive interpretations through disability rights and stuff? Okay, so here's the challenge. Am I to tell someone that their interpretation is forced, or does their interpretation have truth if it is resonant to them? This is one of those dilemmas. Is this art or is this science? If it's science, then you could say, no, this isn't justified. H3O is not water, okay? Water is H2O, that's what it is. But if this is art, then to say if it's beautiful or not, or if it resonates with you, and I'm not the one to judge that. My ear is my ear, my eye is my eye, and my reading is my reading. So I'm a little loath to claim it as being forced or pushed onto the text. I might say, I don't get that, or I don't buy that, it doesn't resonate for me, but I'm not going to tell them that they're wrong or that they're not allowed to say that. It is true that people are trying to save the text. As I mentioned with those rabbis who are still saying this is the Torah that Moses placed before the children of Israel, they don't want to give it up. They don't want to criticize it in public, so they need to find a way to harmonize it. And in the end, you're stuck with the contortions sometimes, if I can be candid, that people go to. So for example, in the American conservative movement, they wanted to be able to ordain gay rabbis. And they were confronted with that passage in Leviticus 18 that says, a man who lies with a man is with a woman, it's abomination, should be stoned to death. And they're stuck. It says it in black and white, so to speak. And there's a whole legacy of rabbinic interpretation that clarifies exactly what they mean by this, which is exactly what is the problem. So what the American conservative movement wound up doing was they put it to their Committee of Laws and Standards, which issued 3 opinions. 2 opinions said, no, we can't ordain male gay rabbis because women homosexuality isn't explicitly prohibited. So maybe it's sort of a minor sin. There's a whole school of thought about that. But they couldn't ordain male gay rabbis. 2 of the opinions said. But the 3rd opinion said, well, where it says a man who lies with a man is with a woman, that can't be done. So, and it's not thinking about homosexuality as an orientation. It's talking about a particular action, or maybe it's thinking about violence, like the description of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the men of the city are attacking Lot's guests and saying, bring the men out so we can know them and have sex with them in a violent way. And so maybe that's what it's referring to. So they found ways to work around the black and white that was there to interpret it. But that's an old rabbinic tradition too. In the Torah, it says very clearly, an eye for an eye, a hand for a hand. If you destroy this in one person, that should be done to you. And the rabbis, very early on, in their first collection of laws in the Mishnah, around the year 200 of the Common Era, say, no, an eye for an eye must mean compensation with money, despite the wording there. And they give some actually compelling examples. For example, what if a man with one eye put out the eye of someone else? So now you're going to take out his eye and he's blind? That's fair compensation for taking out the other? Well, it's irreplaceable, right? It's not commensurate. So in the end, they decide on monetary compensation, which is a clear departure from the text, or again, stoning the stubborn and rebellious child to death. So we've interpreted for a long time. Now, where we depart, I know this is a long answer to a short question, but where we depart is we don't need to find our values in the Torah. We're willing to say, this part we disagree with. This part does not reflect our values. There's sort of a Venn diagram, those 2 overlapping circles. There's the Venn diagram of Torah values. There's the Venn diagram of our values. And there are places where they overlap, the not holding a worker's wages or leaving things for the widow and the orphan. Those are both Torah values and our values. But some of our values, including gender egalitarianism, a kind of humanitarian humanism of treating all people equally, as opposed to the slavery rules differing from Jews and non-Jews, those are cases where our values differ from the Torah, and we're willing to admit it, and we don't need to find them in the Torah text. We're okay saying, A, the Torah is multivocal and doesn't agree with itself, And B, there are times that we don't agree with this Torah law, and that's okay. Again, it's one of the differences in our bar and bat mitzvahs. If our students are reading from a Torah scroll and reading from a story, they can say, God got it wrong here, or Moses is wrong, or the ethics here I disagree with. That's fine. That's, in fact, a mature relationship to one's past, and that's what we aspire to. I think there was one last one. So we have the Torah in the Ark. Does some of it get used in your services? As I mentioned, we use it for our high holiday services, for the evening services with another text being read in the morning. We use it for bar and bat mitzvahs. Although some of our students do, in some ways, the traditional humanistic bar or bat mitzvah by choosing a topic or a hero to talk about, they still will take the Torah out as a symbol, but they don't unroll it because they're not reading from it. They're reading from some other quote in Hebrew literature as part of the presentation. We don't generally use it for a Shabbat service. If I do a Torah portion discussion, certainly in the Zoom era, I find it easier just to share the screen instead of reading from the scroll. And even when we were in person for Shabbat services, I would hand out volumes of the Torah with commentary so people could follow along as I was reading and talking about it instead of reading from the Torah scroll in a kind of performative way. I'd rather have it more interactive. So we have the Torah, we use it for select events, but it's not part of our weekly ritual, and we certainly don't have to follow the Torah portion of the week. We can if we choose to, but we don't have to.
I just want to clarify, sorry, I'm the person who asked that last question.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say you use it on Rosh Hashanah, for example, are you reading like the same thing that they would be reading in a conservative show, or you're just talking about like a portion of it?
I can pick whatever passage I want to reflect the theme of what I'm talking about. So I'll often pick a passage that relates to my sermon topic for that service, or as part of a theme for the high holidays. I usually have a theme for all of the sermons that are put together. There are times I'll go back to the Binding of Isaac story, or the scapegoat story in Leviticus for Yom Kippur. So there are times I'll go back to the traditional readings, but I'm not bound to them. I feel free to choose from other stories too, because after all, this is when I get everybody. I don't get everybody showing up all at once very often. And so it's good sometimes to show them things they might not have heard or read before or very often. So sometimes I will pick some of the more obnoxious texts just to keep it even, and to say, these are things that we don't agree with. Or why are we standing for this when if someone had said this in English, you wouldn't have stood for this, It's worth having that conversation periodically too. Also, by the way, I've been now at this congregation since 2004, so almost 17 years. I don't know how many people remember the last time I read a particular Torah reading if I go back far enough. So, recycling is certainly possible. And of course, when you read the same thing again, it's going to be different when you read it many years later with a different context and purpose, different angle on it. So we're not tied to the traditional reading, just like our bar and bat mitzvah students, or B mitzvah in the gender neutral term, are not required to use the Torah portion of the week. When I'm working with them to choose what their reading is going to be, I do show them what the Torah portion would be for their bar bat mitzvah date, or I'll show them what the Torah portion would be for their birth date, so they see what those are. But if they don't resonate with anything in that section, then we can talk about other Torah stories, other parts of the Hebrew Bible or Hebrew literature more broadly, or again, go the route of a topic, a person, and then find a Hebrew reading later as a supportive quote for the presentation. So again, it's used episodically, and it's used creatively so that we can both ask challenging questions and read the challenging texts that aren't part of the traditional canon of what's read on the high holidays.